Dawn broke slowly over the desert, pale gold light spilling across the sand as if the earth itself was holding its breath, and the chains around her wrists felt colder than the night they had endured. The Apache woman stood tall despite them, her bare feet pressed into the cool ground, her chin lifted in defiance even as exhaustion burned behind her dark eyes. The markings on her face were not paint for beauty or war alone. They were memory, lineage, grief, and pride etched into skin. Across from her stood the cowboy, his hands rough from years of reins and rifles, now trembling slightly as he knelt to the lock at her wrists. He had imagined many things when he rode into that canyon days ago. Danger, blood, regret, but not this moment. Not the weight of her silence. Not the way the rising sun made her look like something carved out of the land itself. Around them, the desert was quiet. The kind of quiet that presses into the chest and forces a man to hear his own thoughts. And his thoughts were loud with doubt. He had been paid to deliver her, traded gold for obedience, told himself she was a prisoner of circumstance, not of his choosing, but the longer he looked at her, the thinner those lies became. She had not screamed when they captured her, had not begged when the chains were tightened, and had not cried through the long night when the cold cut deeper than any blade. Instead, she watched, listened, learned, her eyes sharp as flint, and when he finally reached for the lock at dawn, she spoke for the first time since they met. "I'd rather die than be yours," she said, her voice steady. Not loud, not pleading, but certain, as if she were stating a law older than either of them. The words struck him harder than any curse, and his fingers paused on the metal. He looked up at her then, really looked, and saw not a captive woman but a storm held back by flesh and bone. He had heard stories of the Apache, had grown up on warnings and whispers, but no story had prepared him for the dignity standing before him now. The chain clinked softly as he resumed his work, the sound echoing far too loudly in the stillness, and he wondered not for the first time how he had come to this point, how a boy who once believed the world was divided, neatly into right and wrong, now found himself kneeling in the dirt, deciding the fate of another human being with a simple turn of a key. As the lock resisted, memories rose unbidden. He remembered his father teaching him how to ride before he could read, remembered his mother's hands when she braided his hair, gentle but firm, and remembered the day they were buried after a raid that took everything but his breath. Since then, survival had been his only compass, and survival had led him to do things he never spoke aloud. Delivering her had been just another job, another way to keep moving, to stay ahead of hunger and ghosts. Yet the desert had a way of stripping a man bare, of leaving him alone with truths he could no longer outrun, and standing there in the dawn. He felt those truths closing in. The Apache woman's gaze never left his face, and he sensed she was measuring him the same way he measured horses, testing for weakness, for cruelty, for mercy. When the lock finally clicked open, the sound seemed to ripple through the morning like a gunshot, final and irreversible. He did not step back at once. Instead, he held the loosened chain, unsure whether to remove it completely or wait for her to strike. She did neither. She simply rolled her shoulders as if preparing for pain that might still come. And in that moment, he understood something essential. Freedom, to her, was not a gift he could give, and chains, once placed, left scars deeper than metal ever could. He slid the chain from her wrist slowly, deliberately, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile space between them. When her hands were free, she did not thank him. She did not run. She stood there, rubbing her wrists, eyes still locked on his, and the silence between them stretched until it felt like another living thing. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out and the day fully claimed the sky. "You think cutting chains makes you a good man?" she asked, and there was no accusation in her tone, only a weary honesty that cut deeper than anger. He swallowed, unsure how to answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know what kind of man he was anymore. He had expected relief when he freed her, maybe even redemption, but instead he felt exposed, like the desert wind had stripped him down to something raw and unfinished. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he admitted, the words sounding small in the vastness around them, "but I know keeping them on you would have made me worse." That earned the slightest shift in her expression, not forgiveness, not trust, but acknowledgement. And he clung to it as if it were a lifeline. She took a step back then, creating space, reclaiming it, and he forced himself not to follow. Every instinct told him to mount his horse and ride hard, to leave this moment behind before it demanded more of him than he could give. But another instinct, quieter yet stronger, rooted him to the ground. He watched as she lifted her face to the sun, letting its warmth wash over her, and he realized that whatever happened next, his life had already split into before and after this dawn. He had freed her body, but the real test, the one that would decide who he truly was, had only just begun. If you're feeling the tension of this moment, the weight of choice and consequence, stay with this story. Stories like this are about more than the past. They're about the decisions we all face when no one is watching. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and keep listening, because what happens next, between the cowboy and the Apache, woman will challenge everything they believe about freedom, honor, and survival, and the journey has only just started. The sun climbed higher, burning away the cool mercy of dawn, and with it came the reality neither of them could avoid. Freedom in the desert was not safety, and cutting chains did not erase the men who had put them on in the first place. The Apache woman was the first to move, stepping past him without a word, her eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced awareness of someone who knew the land as kin rather than obstacle. The cowboy watched her go, 1,000 questions pressing against his teeth, but none finding their way out. He knew enough to understand that words spoken too quickly could become weapons, and she had already made it clear she would not accept his kindness as debt. He turned instead to his horse, loosening the reins, pretending to busy himself while listening to the desert breathe around them. Somewhere out there were the men who had paid him, men who would not accept an empty saddle as explanation, and the knowledge settled heavy in his gut like a swallowed stone. She stopped several paces away and turned back, her gaze sharp. "They will come," she said, not as a warning but as a statement of fact. He nodded once. "I know." Silence followed again, thick and deliberate. She studied him the way a hunter studies unfamiliar tracks, reading intention from posture, truth from hesitation. "Then why are you still here?" she asked. He considered the question longer than was comfortable. The honest answer was tangled and inconvenient. Because leaving felt like cowardice. Because staying felt like penance. Because for the first time in years, he was tired of running from the choices he'd made. "Because I don't think riding away fixes what I broke," he said finally. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in assessment, and she turned away again, this time angling toward a line of low scrub and stone that promised cover. From the open flats, they moved together without agreement. Not allies, not enemies, but something undefined and fragile. As they walked, the land changed subtly, sand giving way to hard-packed earth and scattered rock, the kind of ground that held memories in its cracks. She moved with quiet confidence, each step deliberate, and he realized how loud he must seem by comparison, how clumsy his boots were against the silence. He slowed his pace, matching hers, learning without asking. In his chest, tension coiled tight. The knowledge that every moment they delayed increased the risk to both of them. Yet he did not press her to hurry. She had earned the right to set the rhythm now. When they reached the rocks, she crouched low, signaling him to do the same, and he followed without question. From there, the desert stretched wide and unforgiving, but the vantage offered sightlines he knew well enough to read. "They'll split up," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "They always do." She glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "You know them," she said. He nodded. "I rode with worse." The admission hung between them, raw and unadorned. He did not justify it, did not excuse it, and she seemed to recognize the difference. She turned back to the horizon, and for the first time, he felt something like the beginning of trust, not given, but cautiously considered. Time passed in long, stretched moments. Heat shimmered, insects buzzed, and the desert watched as it always did, indifferent yet eternal. As they waited, she spoke, her voice low. "They took my brother," she said, eyes never leaving the distance. "Not to sell, to make an example." The words were flat, stripped of emotion by repetition and pain. He felt a tightness in his throat. The weight of knowing his world had created hers. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way apologies rarely reached. She did not respond, but she did not tell him to stop speaking either, and he took that as permission. "If they catch you again," he continued, "they won't chain you. They'll kill you." She finally looked at him then, and the fire in her gaze was unmistakable. "They already tried," she said. "I am still here." A shape appeared on the horizon, then another. Riders. Even at a distance, he recognized the posture, the arrogance of men who believed the land bent to their will. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. He was not sure what right he had to draw it now. She noticed the hesitation and surprised him by speaking first. "You can leave," she said. "Ride fast. They will not follow you far." He met her gaze and shook his head. Not this time. The decision settled something inside him, firm and final. He was done choosing the path that let him sleep while others paid the cost. When the riders drew closer, she melted back into the rocks, her presence becoming suggestion rather than form. He stayed visible, mounting his horse slowly, deliberately. The men approached with confidence that faltered when they saw his empty saddle. "Where is she?" one of them demanded. The cowboy met his stare evenly. "Gone," he said. A laugh followed, sharp and humorless. "You think we'll believe that?" The man sneered. The cowboy shrugged. "You can believe whatever you like." Tension snapped tight, the space between words and violence thinning to nothing. He knew how this ended. He had lived it too many times. But as the first man reached for his gun, a sound cut through the air, swift, deadly, and the man fell. An arrow buried deep. Chaos erupted. Shouts, gunfire, horses rearing. The Apache woman moved like a shadow among the rocks, precise and relentless, every motion driven by survival and memory. The cowboy found himself fighting not beside her but in response to her rhythm, covering angles, moving when she moved, trusting without ever looking back. It was not partnership born of agreement but of necessity, and it worked. When the dust settled, the desert reclaimed its silence, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing. He stood there, heart hammering, hands shaking now that the danger had passed. She emerged slowly, eyes scanning for threats, then turned to him. "You could have run," she said again, softer this time. "I know," he nodded. "I didn't." She studied him for a long moment, and in that look was 1,000 questions she did not ask. Finally, she inclined her head once. Not gratitude, recognition. "Then ride with me," she said. "For now." The words carried no promise beyond the present, but they were more than he had expected, and he accepted them with the seriousness they deserved. As they prepared to move, the path ahead uncertain and dangerous, he understood that redemption was not a single act, but a series of choices, each one harder than the last. Their journey was no longer about chains alone, but about what came after they were broken, about whether two people from opposite sides of a brutal line could survive without losing themselves. Stay with this story and subscribe to the channel, because the final chapter will take them into the heart of that question, where loyalty, sacrifice, and freedom will demand a price neither of them is fully prepared to pay. They rode until the sun tilted west and the desert began to change its voice, the heat softening into a breath that carried memory instead of threat. The Apache woman led without looking back, guiding them through paths that did not exist to outsiders, places where stone and shadow told stories older than conquest. The cowboy followed, every muscle aware, not only of danger, but of the fragile trust riding between them like a third presence. He did not ask her name. Names had power, and power was earned. Instead, he watched, learned, and listened to the land the way she did, discovering that survival was less about force and more about respect. Behind them lay bodies, blood, and the final severing of the life he once knew. Ahead waited consequences far heavier than pursuit, because now he was no longer a man drifting between jobs. He had chosen a side, and the land would remember. As dusk gathered, they reached a narrow valley cut deep into the earth, walls rising like ancient sentinels. She dismounted first, signaling him to follow, and together, they led the horse into cover, where its silhouette would not betray them. Only then did she finally turn to face him fully, the fading light painting her markings in fire and shadow. "From here our paths may split," she said, "or they may bind tighter than chains." He felt the weight of her words settle into his bones. "I'm not here to own what isn't mine," he replied. "I just want to make right what I helped break." The honesty surprised even him, but it did not feel weak. It felt clean, like water after drought. She studied him in silence, and in that silence, he sensed the ghost she carried, the brother taken, the nights spent watching her world shrink under boots and bullets, the lessons learned too young about what mercy cost. When she spoke again, her voice carried the sound of wind through stone. "Freedom is not given," she said. "It is taken back." He nodded slowly. "Then let me help you take it," he said. Not as a demand, not as a promise of protection, but as an offer of shared risk. Something shifted then, subtle but unmistakable, and she exhaled as if releasing a breath she'd held since dawn. That night they built no fire. They ate in silence, each lost in thought, and when sleep finally came it was light and broken. The cowboy dreamed of chains falling into dust, of hands reaching for him that he could not quite grasp. She dreamed of running water and voices calling her home. At first light she woke him with a single word. Listen. He did and understood. Horses, many of them. Not the reckless charge of hunters drunk on power, but the disciplined movement of warriors who knew the land and moved with it. Her people. Relief and fear tangled in his chest. Relief that she would not face what came next alone. Fear because he knew how little forgiveness the world held for men like him. They emerged slowly, hands visible, posture open. From the rocks stepped men and women alike, eyes sharp, weapons ready. The Apache woman spoke first, her voice carrying authority and pain, telling of capture, of chains of escape. She did not hide his role in her suffering, nor did she hide his choice at dawn. Murmurs rippled through the group like wind through grass. The cowboy stood still, accepting whatever judgment would fall. He knew this moment mattered more than survival. It was about truth spoken without defense. An elder stepped forward, face lined by years and memory. His gaze rested on the broken chain still tied at the cowboy's saddle. Why did you cut them? The elder asked. The cowboy swallowed. Because keeping them made me the kind of man I don't want to be, he said. And because she deserved the chance to choose her own end. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. The elder nodded once. Choice, he repeated. That is the beginning of freedom. He turned to the Apache woman. And what do you choose? She did not hesitate. I choose my people, she said. Then after a pause that made the cowboy's heart stop, she added, and I choose that he leaves alive. The word struck him harder than any blow, not because she spared him, but because she did so freely. The elder studied her, then him. You will ride, he said to the cowboy. Not as a friend, not as an enemy, but as a man who knows what his choices cost. The judgment was fair. It always had been. As the group turned away, the Apache woman stepped closer to him. Our paths split here, she said softly, but dawn changed us both. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his chest. Thank you, he managed. She shook her head. Live in a way that honors the cut you made. He mounted his horse and rode as the sun climbed, each step carrying him farther from her and closer to something like peace. He did not look back. He did not need to. The desert watched him go, and for the first time it did not feel like judgment. It felt like witness. Somewhere behind him chains lay broken, not just on the ground, but in the quiet places inside him that had been bound by fear and survival for too long. Stories like this remind us that redemption is not loud and freedom is not simple. It is found in moments where we choose differently, even when no one would blame us for choosing easy. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of choice and the courage to change, make sure to subscribe to the channel. More powerful stories are waiting, and the next one might change the way you see the world, just as this dawn changed them both.